Rupert, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. So I teach philosophy at the University of East Anglia. I also co-direct an outfit called the Moderate Flank Incubator. This has come out of the work I did with XR. So going back a little bit, I helped to launch Extinction Rebellion and was one of their key strategists and spokespeople. But after a couple of years, I realized that what we really needed to do was to appeal to a far wider sector of the public. So while the radical flank had some success, it was time to try to found a new moderate flank. So I co-direct the Moderate Flank Incubator, and we're trying to help to make that happen. As part of my philosophical work and more generally, I also publish quite a few books and so forth.
Cool. So tell me about your research into the climate crisis and what do you think is the worst possible outcome? That's one of the most questions I'm most interested about.
Yeah. So my recent book on this, Why Climate Breakdown Matters, is right on this. The prognosis that I set out in there is that it's almost certainly worse than you think, that things are really very, very bad. You've asked how bad could they get? Well, we don't really know. It seems very, very unlikely now that they could end up with the Earth being essentially like Venus. But it seems entirely possible if we really carry on fucking things up as badly as we're doing at the present. Seems entirely possible that we could get various kind of runaway effects over the coming centuries, which would be enough to more or less extinguish the human race. And my view is that it is likely that what we're going to get is a civilization ending event. When I say civilization ending, I don't mean that there won't be any more civilization. What I mean is that there won't be this civilization. I think that's the most likely scenario in terms of what we're actually facing and expecting. So yeah, this is at the heart of my philosophical work and also at the heart of my campaigning work.
So the research I've read indicates that it's possible that the amount of arable land might increase due to global warming. Decrease, of course, will in certain areas like Africa, but increase in the more European regions. And so it will definitely negatively impact many societies. But the net overall outcome may or may not increase the amount of food we could potentially have. And so, what is the kind of catastrophe that could lead to a civilization ending outcome?
Mm.
Because it seems like of the things I've read, it doesn't necessarily seem like it would be that bad.
Well, it's not necessarily going to be that bad. And obviously, part of the reason why I do what I do is that I think it is possible for us to turn things around. I think it is possible for us to transform this civilization into something very different so that it doesn't collapse. And I think even if there are civilization collapse events that come down the track at us, there is still enormous scope for them to be more or less severe, more or less well recovered from, etc. But in terms of your specific point about arable land, I'm pretty skeptical of that. One very simple fact to remember about the Earth is that the closer you go towards the poles, the less and less of the Earth there is. The lines of longitude come closer and closer together. If you look at an image of the Earth from above the North Pole, it's astonishing how small it looks, basically. It's astonishing how small the Arctic is. I mean, of course, it's a massive wilderness compared to, most of the spaces that most of us spend most of our lives in. But in terms of surface area, the old Mercator projection doesn't do us any favors here, right? It makes the south of the planet and the north of the planet look just as big as the center of the planet. But of course, they're not. So the Mercator projection makes it look as though Greenland is as big as Africa, but it's an order of magnitude smaller than Africa. So one simple basic point, if everything gets pushed further north and further south, there is less land for it to be pushed into. Another crucial point, which is often...
If you don't mind me interrupting right there just for a little bit. So America, I think, is the country with the most arable land of all of them. And it's in the Northern Hemisphere. And so even though I totally agree that the maps we have are very disproportionate and have some very interesting side effects of that, it seems like if we increase the temperature in America, that would drastically increase the arable land because we have the most. It seems like these northern regions that you're talking about are the ones that typically have more arable land, like Africa. A lot of it's desert, and so increasing the temperature there wouldn't reduce the arable land by much because there isn't much there. And so it seems like the reason the arable land would increase is because we would be increasing the overall temperature in the areas where it is typically the most arable land.
Well, no, I don't think that follows, I'm afraid. For one thing, it is quite likely that there will be dust bowl and semi-desertification effects in the North American continent as a result of the climate damage that is coming. But more generally, the point that I just made still holds valid, that there is just, if you look at Asia, for example, I mean, Russia looks absolutely vast on maps, and of course it is. But the further north you go in it, the less land there is. There's another very important dimension to this, which is that a lot of the soils in more northerly regions are very poor. So interesting fact about Canada, in most of Canada, there are no earthworms because they were wiped out during the last ice age and they haven't returned yet. Now, without earthworms, you have drastically poorer soil, basically, than with earthworms. In terms of the Asian continent, which boils down to primarily to Russia, the situation isn't quite as bad, but there are serious issues with a lot of the soil fertility in the Siberian type areas. And
Quick question:
so,
you mentioned that they're out of earthworms. Why didn't we just like bring them back? What is
yeah,
the reason?
well, that's interesting you should ask that. So earthworms are starting to make their own way into some of these northern areas of Canada. But that's not working out very well either, because the ecosystems there are not used to them. And many of these transitions, you know, they're quite rough. Whereas what we need in our sort of stable, large-scale human civilizations is for transitions to go smoothly. We've basically had it incredibly lucky during the Holocene, and the Holocene is now at an end. We're into the so-called Anthropocene. There's a lot of debate about whether that's the right name for it. But whatever it is, the era of safety and calmness is over. And the kind of transition that we're going to have now, it's going to be very rough. If we'd have started in a serious way trying to transform our systems a generation ago, or even better, 2 generations ago, we could have avoided that. But there's no avoiding now the very rough path that is ahead. We need to pull together to prepare for that. We need to do that on a neighborhood level, a community level, a society level, a global level. There's going to be no individual survivalism in what's coming.
And what exactly is coming? So what are the changes that you think will cause the societal collapse based on the climate?
Yeah, as I say, I'm not certain that there is going to be a societal collapse, and nobody is. If anyone tells you that there definitely is or definitely isn't, that's a good reason not to trust them. I think that what we have to be prepared for is the various potential scenarios that are ahead. So what are those kind of scenarios? What are some of the things that are likely or that we should be investing in preparing ourselves for? So obviously they include things like gradual sea level rise. And that's a very serious matter, given how much of the world's infrastructure and people and so on live very close to the sea. But actually, I'm a lot less concerned about sea level rise than some of the other processes that are coming that could be much more exponential. You know, the good news about sea level rise is that even in the worst case scenario, it's not going to be, you know, overnight. You're not suddenly going to have like sea levels a meter higher or something like that. You know, that will never, ever conceivably happen.
Right.
But
The projections are like 2 feet in the next 100 or in the next 80 years or something along those lines.
yeah, that kind of thing. And you know, it may be more than that, but even if it is, the point is it's not sudden. But there are processes here that are sudden, or at least are potentially sudden. So, you know, a lot of my concern lies around food and water, where we're talking about climate systems, but we're also talking about human systems. And there are deep vulnerabilities baked into these systems, particularly, arguably, the world's food system. So in terms of what's coming, we're facing growing waves of vulnerability, and vulnerabilities that we have to adapt to. We have to be proactive about. And we have to do that in a way which is systemic and transformative, and is responsive to continual surprises along the way, to what my colleague Nassim Taleb calls black swans. We should expect that there will be increasing numbers of black swans over the coming period, because it's been clear to people since about 2016, 2017, 2018 that we have now destabilized the climate in a significant way. It's not going to be restabilized for an incredibly long time, even under the best possible scenarios. So a lot of what we have to be ready for is uncertainty and taking precautions against things which we cannot know in advance their exact nature.
And
But
black swans would be like really bad storms or something, really significantly bad events.
yeah, black swans are things which are not in our experience and cannot be predicted. So you can predict them. You can predict that there will be more of them, and you can predict their sort of broad outlines. So you can predict, for example, that we're likely to get hurricanes or typhoons of a kind that we've never had before over the coming generation. But you can't predict exactly what that will be like, because we've never had them before. You can't predict, obviously, where and when they will befall. It's that kind of thing, but it's more. It goes further than that, because the kind of events that we should be readying ourselves for in human terms are to do with the consequences of those kinds of events, right? So they're to do with as I say, the kind of knock-on effects to the food system and other more or less human systems that we've come to rely on. So one implication of this is we ought to be getting much more serious about building community resilience, building resilience into our food systems, thinking about water storage, thinking about not being so dependent on rain-fed agriculture, thinking about being far less dependent upon long supply chains, and so on and so forth.
Well, could you give some examples of like what are the actual consequences, like the physical changes in the environment that are going to happen because of climate change? Supposing we do nothing, just ignore it. Because when I go through the lists of all the different climate change activist websites, and they say all the different things that are going to happen, it's like decreasing coral colorization, increased salinization of the oceans. Some species are going to be affected, but I want to like a loss of life perspective. How do we calculate this number of people are going to die? Because there was a recent study that came out that said in the next by 2100, the next 80 years, about 83 million people will die due to climate change or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the next 80 years, 7 billion people are going to die because we're all going to die of old age by that point. So comparatively, that number seems pretty small. And so I don't
Yeah.
understand, based on that number, it seems like the projected risk of climate change is significantly smaller than what it's being portrayed as in the media.
Yeah, good. That's a good, fair question. So my response is that I think that those kinds of estimates, when people say 100 million people are going to die from the climate or something over the next century, I think they are likely to prove drastic underestimates. And I think in particular that we have to take into account the possibility that they could be massive underestimates, unless we, get our act together in a far, far more serious way than we have done so far. So there's an interesting paper that relates to this by my colleague Luke Kemp last year, which basically said the high danger kind of climate scenarios are under-researched, and it's those that need to be looked into. Human beings can be incredibly resilient and cope with all sorts of terrible crap being thrown at them. It looks as though the total death toll from COVID so far is probably about 15 million, for example. It could have been many times that if we hadn't responded in quite a lot of the world in a reasonably precautious, reasonably effective way. So, I'm not saying that definitely the death toll is going to end up being higher than 83 million. But I think it could be a lot higher than that. I think it could be 1 billion. I think it could be in the billions. And the reason I think that is to do with what I was saying about 5-10 minutes ago, namely that what we have to think about here is the vulnerability of systems. If entire systems start to fall over, perhaps quite rapidly, the world's food system, there isn't a huge amount of redundancy built into it. We've got, for example, these choke points in the way that food and other commodities are moved around the world. Points such as the Suez Canal. We got a little bit of taste of that, didn't we, last year when that boat got stuck in the Suez Canal? All it takes, and things like that are becoming more and more likely. So look at some of the big rivers, for example, which are important for moving food and other things around. We've had events recently where major rivers such as the Rhine in Germany became virtually impassable to boats because the water level went down too much because of drought. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen more and more often. When you get these kinds of events ramifying into each other, you get what's called multi-breadbasket failure, or conditions that simulate multi-breadbasket failure, which means that the world's bread baskets are no longer delivering. And if that happens to 2 or 3 of them at the same time, well, then we're in real trouble. That's the kind of thing that with every year, it becomes more likely until we get to the point where we've actually managed to stop the damage getting worse. And we are so far away from that point. People are talking about that point being 2050. On current policies, even that is over optimistic, but that is hopelessly inadequate in terms of, if we were to really, people talk about this as an emergency. If we were really treating it as an emergency, would we let it get worse for the next 28 years? It's just a joke to say that this is being treated as an emergency. And of course, in my work, I argue that it's much worse than an emergency, because an emergency is something that you can get away from, you can run away from, or you can solve it, you can end it, you can stop it. None of these things apply to this situation. This is essentially a new permanent condition that we are in. It has a tragic dimension. It's something we have to get used to, as something which is going to more and more define all of our lives. So I call it a more than emergency, but we are treating it as a less than emergency. And that's a very serious matter. The gap between a less than emergency and an emergency is enormous. The gap between an emergency and a more than emergency is again enormous. So we are so far off the pace.
So catastrophe would be the thing above emergency.
Yeah, exactly. Where we're headed right now is towards catastrophe. It is possible to stop that, but in my judgment and in that of my colleagues in the moderate flank, it is only possible to stop it. It is only possible to change trajectory if we actually recognize the trajectory that we're on, because we're not going to get sufficient action here without a mass mobilization of all kinds, far greater than anything we've seen so far. We need millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people to make it their life's purpose to do what is necessary in this tragic and terrible situation that we've got ourselves into. And I very much hope, obviously, that among those people will turn out to be many of the people who are listening to this conversation.
For sure. So the main threat that you have articulated so far is that there might be something that leads to a supply chain block, and if multiple of these things happen sequentially, then it could potentially lead to millions of deaths and starvation or something along those lines. But let's say that none of the sequential black swan events happen. What else is going to happen that will cause damage that we need to be concerned about?
Well, where do you want to start? There are so many dimensions to this. One which is relevant to what we've been talking about, which we haven't mentioned so far, is the worrying fact that as temperatures rise, it appears that most forms of food become less nutritious. So in some forms of food, going back to what you were saying a lot earlier, Tom, you may get temporarily increased yields you are likely to diminish levels of nutrition. Here's another kind of fun fact for you. Did you know that raised levels of carbon dioxide make people more stupid? The more carbon dioxide there is in the air, the more IQ goes down. That's not really an immediate concern, but if the levels carry on building up and building up, it will start to be of interest. Something much more serious, which we haven't talked about yet, a whole different dimension to the problem, is what's going on in the oceans. So the oceans have absorbed a significant percentage so far of the excess heat that we've booted into the atmosphere. And the oceans have absorbed a really significant percentage of the excess carbon that we booted into the atmosphere. But firstly, the oceans are starting to lose their capacity to do this. And secondly, and connected with that, the oceans are changing in a way which is damaging and dangerous to the inhabitants of the oceans, obviously, and to ourselves. So one symptom of that, of course, which you mentioned earlier, is what's happening to our coral reefs, which is really tragic. I mean, this is happening right now. The world's coral reefs are being demolished, in real time. And we don't know what the prognosis is. We don't know how many of them are going to manage to adapt, but it's not looking good. And the Great Barrier Reef is in terrible trouble, and so are most other coral reefs. So it's just awful beyond words. It's
Well,
good.
that part I don't think I quite understand, because it's like I see the coral reef and those kinds of ecological features as mostly, I don't know, aesthetics on Earth. So if I'm, as a human, I care about human life. Human life is the most important thing. If all the coral reefs died, I'd be like, oh well, that's sad. Kind of like if a painting got damaged, like, oh well, too bad. But it's not really that important. It's not a huge impact. Should we uproot our economical systems in order to prevent that? I'd say no. I say that prioritizing human life is significantly more important, and if we could minimize any economical restrictions that would impact human life negatively, that would be prioritized over the life of the coral reefs. I don't see why they would be very important whatsoever.
Well, I guess there's a few things I'd say in response to that. One is that if one has spent any time in coral reefs, they are fantastically inspiring and beautiful places. They're among the absolute crown jewels of this incredible planet. And you said just aesthetics. I think that sometimes things like this they really matter, and it really matters that human beings are taken care of them, and it really matters that human beings have them to escape to, and so forth. Another dimension is that a very high percentage of the ocean's biodiversity, in other words, life, is to be found in coral reefs. So you're taking an enormous whack out of what's in the ocean, which has significant effects in terms of, for example, food growing potential of the oceans. But what I was actually coming on to is that what's happening to the coral reefs is also a symptom of something much more serious that may be building up, which is the acidification of the ocean, which is the biggest problem for the coral, which is coming from the carbon, basically starting to very gradually turn the ocean into acid. The acidification of the oceans we don't know that this is true, but it could represent a massive threat, not only to most life in the oceans, but to most life on Earth. The combination of ocean acidification, ocean pollution, including plastic pollution, and the greenhouse effect and rising temperatures could tip the oceans over the next generation or two into a place which is unsuitable for the life of most plankton and unsuitable for the life of most multi-celled creatures. That will have numerous terrible effects, including ultimately it could result in a significant reduction in the oxygen levels in the atmosphere. And obviously, when you get to something like that, then you're starting to get to something which is going to have a massive effect on human beings and other land animals. We don't know that any of this is going to happen, but we ought to apply the logic of precaution here. If there is even a small chance, and as far as I can tell, it's more than a small chance, that something like this might start to happen, and the ocean acidification could have massive consequences both within and beyond the ocean, then that ought to make our situation and action on our situation a lot more urgent, and ought to get us to treat it, as I say, not even as an emergency, but as something which is much more serious than an emergency, as something which is really hard for us to imagine, just how the magnitude of what we're talking about here in terms of what could unfold over the next century.
But how do we test that? Because my first concern is that it's like the Manhattan Project, where they were working on the nuclear weapons, and they had a concern
Yeah.
that igniting a nuclear weapon could ignite the atmosphere and everyone dies. And obviously, that's a big concern. And so they had to find some way to calculate that and figure out whether or not that was a serious threat. But given the way our system currently works, we can't just stop everything we're doing, because that would immediately kill millions of people if we just stopped using
Mm.
carbon like immediately. And so we have to say this is a potential hypothetical risk, but should we, based on this hypothetical risk, put limitations on our current economy, which will definitely kill people? Or I would say probably not, until we have some kind of verifiable means to confirm this hypothesis that it may be more than that. And so I think that we need some kind of like Manhattan Project calculation to figure out, is this a genuine concern or not, before we can really say that it's a valid justification to take action one way or the other. And what would that method be? How would we potentially confirm whether this is a genuine risk?
Yeah, so look, of course, you're right that we can't just stop everything that we're doing literally overnight. But the logic of it being a more than emergency is that we should stop it, or rather transform it, as quickly as we possibly can. And of course, there are precedents here. There's the amazing stuff that was done in relation to the Manhattan Project or the Apollo Project, but more relevant, arguably, is the kind of transformation that occurred during the Second World War. So I'm very struck, for example, by the story of what happened when Franklin Roosevelt and his team went to the motor manufacturers and presented them with their plans for producing tanks when America was getting into the war. And the motor manufacturers looked through the plans and said, "But Mr. President, there must be something wrong here. We've looked at your plans, and the implications of these is that we wouldn't be able to produce any motor cars for the next several years." And Roosevelt was like, "Yeah, you got it." That's about the level of seriousness. Would anyone die if we stopped producing motor cars in the next several years? No, no one would die. There are transformations that we can do here which are potential win-wins, and that's what we need to be looking for. I mean, not everything is going to be a win-win, but there are loads of win-wins here. If we move away rapidly from fossil energy and have a lot more renewable energy, there will be a massive reduction in air pollution. We can relocalize our societies and regenerate a much greater spirit of community and a sense of security and a sense of meaning. I mean, and that's ultimately, of course, what this is about. And of course, this is part of my interest in it as a philosopher. A lot of people are suffering from a crisis of meaning. Well, this is about what could be more meaningful than being part of a vast effort to head off a mortal threat to the entire future of the human race and much other life on Earth. There are all sorts of win-wins here. It's
Well, just
not
to
going to
jump in on
be.
that, I wanted to, because
Mhm.
I think that the major argument from the other side is that the economy and how the human economy is run is equally as much, um, equally as fragile, and doesn't have the redundancies as our ecological ecosystem. And so if we do make substantive changes to the economy, there's a big risk that those could have similar kinds of black swan events that, if they happen, would equally kill millions of people. Like if we went into another depression, food wasn't available, nobody could buy it, and they starved to death. And so making sweeping changes to the economy is a huge risk to the lives of millions of people, and a much more immediate risk than, say, the climate change catastrophe. And so if we did decide to for example, change all the car factories and stop producing cars for years, what negative impact would that have on our economy and other economies to tank the dollar and make the dollar not the fundamental currency throughout the world? And then how could that cause massive inflation, which could then increase the prices of food to the point where the poor can't buy them and they starve to death? It seems like there's a greater risk because of how fragile the economy is to making those sweeping changes, which could immediately kill millions of people. That would be a concern. And is it worth the risk of trying to accommodate that based on a hypothesis that we don't have proven? For example, like the acidification of the oceans. If we haven't
Yeah.
proven that yet, it's just a hypothesis, kind of like the igniting the atmosphere, and we don't have any hard proof. Should we put a strain on the economy, which directly risks millions of lives, in order to
Yeah.
try to accommodate the potential risk of the acidification of the oceans without hard proof?
Yeah. So remember that I introduced that as a massive potential concern, and I was explicit that, as you just said, we're not so sure about it. There are other things which we are a lot more sure about. I mean, we're sure that if we carry on down the present path, it's going to be absolutely catastrophic. So the ocean acidification thing is supposed to be an additional reason for why we ought to be erring on the side of precaution. And that's what this is about, really, in philosophical terms. It's about the logic of precaution. So you can talk, sure, about, the risk of we might throw ourselves into a depression, and that could have really bad effects, and so on and so forth. But there are threats that are existential, and when threats are genuinely existential, what the logic of precaution says is that you must take those threats more seriously than concerns about, there could be an economic downturn, etc. So what I'm really saying is, let's take existential threats seriously, which we're not even remotely doing at the present time. Let's take seriously the looming and growing risk, which is massively under researched, but which is already clear to our food systems and water systems. Let's take seriously the threat to our oceans, and again, research it more. But don't just wait for the research to be 100% cast iron before you act. Because if you do that, you're going to be waiting too long, right? And that is how the precautionary principle operates. So we applied it to some extent, for example, in the 1980s, when we started to move to seriously rein in CFCs, ozone depleting chemicals, in the 1980s. We didn't have 100% proof of their deadly damaging properties to the atmosphere. But we started anyway before we had that proof, because if we'd have waited till we had 100% proof, we could have sent the whole of civilization into destruction. And that is a really important point, that it's not necessary for everything to wait until you have full scientific proof before you act. If what you're acting to do is to keep us safe and head off a mortal threat.
Oh, I would definitely agree, but I'd say that it's contextual, dependent upon the risk that you are implying by investing a certain amount of funds. So if you say, if suppose World War II, Hitler's winning, and we have to build nuclear weapons, and we don't have time to figure out if it's going to ignite the atmosphere, we just got to go for it. Got to stop Hitler from taking over the world, even if it burns the world. That's still got to do it. And so in the case of the ozone, there wasn't a lot of risk. We could just replace I forget what they were called, the things that were going into the atmosphere and depleting the ozone. We could just replace them with another very commonly available medium that did the exact same thing and didn't cause damage to the atmosphere. It was pretty benign, wasn't really a big risk. Okay, yeah, just do it. Who cares? But in cases like the big changes to using fossil fuels support the lives of billions of people. Like it is the primary means by which people survive everywhere in the world is fossil fuels right now. And so putting a constraint on that is definitely a big risk to people's lives. That is something that is a huge concern, especially economically. Even in rich countries where we have sufficiently enough food, our most valuable resource right now is confidence in the economy, because if you don't have that, then we lose everything. And so putting that at risk is also putting millions of lives at risk. And so, given the possibility of a world-ending catastrophe, I could say like maybe there's aliens who really value cows like the Hindus, and if we kill cows, the aliens are going to come and just murder us all. Given that that's a possibility, should we then stop
No, no,
harvesting
no.
cows?
No, come, Tom. That's not a good analogy, is it? I've written about this in some of my published philosophical work. The precautionary principle is not about guarding against, totally outlandish, dreamed up fantasies, right? It's about guarding against things which are rational to fear, things that are real possibilities. And I think this ocean acidification thing, it definitely passes that minimal test. But just to say once again, this is just one part of a much bigger picture. Now, in terms of fossil fuels, let's be very clear. Fossil fuels are killing us right now through air pollution and through climate disasters, and that effect will only grow and grow, perhaps exponentially, unless we act very radically and very soon. So in order to get really clear about this, there's a little game that I like to play with people. And if you'll indulge me for
Sure.
a second, Tom, just play it, which is most people don't realize just how vicious, just how strong the greenhouse effect is. So let's see between you and me, Tom, where you might land on this, and then you can get a sense of what we're talking about here. So when you burn, say, a liter of oil, right, in your car engine, whatever, you burn a liter of oil, that produces some heat, right? And that's what we want from it. We want the heat that it produces to power the engine. And it also, at the same time, releases some carbon, which traps some heat in the atmosphere, right? That's the greenhouse effect. And that's what's causing the real trouble here. So the question is, the little game, the guessing game is, how much stronger, because it is stronger, how much stronger do you think the greenhouse effect is than the direct effect? In other words, from the carbon that gets trapped in the atmosphere, how much more heat is trapped close to the Earth than the heat that is generated directly by burning the oil? Do you understand the question?
Sort of, but my concern would be is like over what time period, because the heat trap is
Okay, yeah,
coming from
so
the
that's a fair
sun.
question. Yeah, the time period is over its entire life in the atmosphere, so it's an average of
Oh, it's
maybe
going to
about
be billions, billions,
no,
billions
no,
of
no,
times
it's
more.
not that. It's not that. It's over about 500 years. Over about 500 years. How
500
much?
years.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be a huge, significant amount because the heat from the sun
Good.
is tremendous, and it's going to come in the atmosphere, reflect off of surfaces on the Earth, hit the particles in the air, and reflect back. And it's going to continue to do
That's
that,
it.
and it's going to
Yeah.
build hundreds of thousands of times, potentially more than the amount of heat generated by the engine, because
Okay.
it's going to.
You well done. You're the first person who's ever pretty much got it. Almost everybody guesses like 10 times as much, 50 times as much, 1,000 times as much. The actual figure is about 60,000. So the heat you get from burning a liter of oil, the heat that gets trapped over time, 60,000 times as much as the heat you get directly that we use, the heat that we want. Now, if you will, that's a measure of the unbelievable inefficiency, right, of fossil fuels. You see what I mean? You
I'm
burn
not sure.
they seem very efficient, right? You burn a liter of oil, it produces all this heat, but 60,000 times as much, as it were, waste heat is results from it, right? 60,000 times as much heat that comes back to bite us. That's why we're in the terrible trouble that we're in, because this effect is incredibly powerful.
Oh, sure, absolutely. But I think like if we compare the positive effect of a human life versus the detriment of the amount of heat accumulated in the atmosphere, the amount of
But
positive
that's
impact of
but that's
well, because I
60,000.
think
That's coming back to bite us, right? And we're seeing it now, right? Like in my country, the last summer we had our first ever temperature over 40 degrees centigrade. The apples went black on the trees because they've never experienced temperatures that high before. This is the uncharted territory we're moving into. This is the horrible danger that we're moving into.
well, so my concern is that if we currently compare the amount of lives fossil fuels have saved versus the amount of lives that the climate has killed, uh, for the past 200 years or so since we've been using fossil fuels. Even granting the 60,000 times of heat inefficiency, so far the amount of lives oil has saved drastically outweighs any that have been cost by the heat efficiency metric that you've used. In the future, that may change if we go to global catastrophe, but currently the lives impacted by oil from that inefficiency has been saved in the billions. Billions of people have been saved by fossil fuels being used to heat their homes, to used for agricultural reasons, because most agriculturists uses fossil fuels to use coal and electricity to power hospitals and all kinds of things. So the even given the inefficiency, the amount of positive impact on human lives to this day drastically leans in favor of use of fossil fuels. The question is will it shift in the future? And so I don't think that the amount of heat inefficiency in and of itself is that important. What matters is which has a more positive impact on human life. And it seems past tense, oil has had a much more positive impact than the negative side of the heat accumulation in the atmosphere to this point. And the question is what the future will look like. And so I don't think that that number, while impressive, is necessarily a good representation of what the important variable is, which I think is the quality of human life.
Well, there's a number of ways we could come at that. I mean, maybe we should open up a different tack, which is how much has that oil really improved human life? Yeah, in kind of terms of crude GDP, you know, the evidence is overwhelming. But we're in a world now where there is an absolute epidemic of mental health, ill health. I mean, an epidemic of loneliness. Vast waves of people experiencing huge amounts of meaninglessness, collapse of belief systems.
But are you saying this is directly
etc.
related? Just to clarify, are you saying that that's related to fossil fuels? Because I don't.
Of course it is. Of course it is. Because it's fossil fuels that have driven the insane industrial growthist capitalist expansionism, which has transformed the world over the past few centuries. And what we really need to do now is start to think, okay, what are the actual, the truly good things that have come from this transformation? For example, on balance, the improvement in the position of women and sexual minorities. What are the things that we really want to hold on to? You know, things like the possibility of worldwide communications. And how do we let go of the things which are actually not good, like the rampant insecurity, the loneliness, the existential risk, the epidemic of mental ill health, which is going to get worse and worse, the absolutely insane and grotesque levels of inequality which the system have produced, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of question we ought to be asking. We ought to be asking, given that our civilization is going to have to transform itself anyway, because if we carry on with this civilization, we're simply going to go flying further and further off the cliff and gradually, or not so gradually, come to grief. Given that we have to transform anyway, we should be thinking, okay, how do we effectuate this transformation in a way which actually improves, as you put it, human quality of life? What are the good aspects, for example, of the internet that we can hold on to without, you know, the absolute torrent of crap that the internet has given us by way of so-called social media platforms and so forth, which have, you know, drastically deformed our politics and driven so many people into misery and so on and so forth. You know, let's talk about quality of life if that's the conversation you want to have.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I'm a little lost on the connection to like depression and loneliness epidemics and its relation to fossil fuels, because it seems like if we have a
Well, the
means
epidemic
to
of
keep.
depression is a lot to do. It's got complex causes. One of the main causes is the epidemic increase in inequality, which is
Oh yeah,
clearly related to the form of fossil fuel driven economic growth that we've had.
well, I don't see like how that would be specifically relevant to fossil fuels. It seems like any economic system, even let's suppose we had like any kind of clean energy, if it was still owned by a corporation, you're still going to have inequality. They're still going to use it to make money.
Hmm.
But so my initial concern is that obviously with a larger population, they're going to have more people who are depressed, um, because in the past, people who were depressed couldn't provide for
The,
themselves, and so they died. They were just dead. And
the
so the fact that
percentage,
we have means one sec. So just but the fact that we have means to keep them alive and give them medication and all these foods and provide them lots of resources and keep them alive in ways that we could not in the past, I think is due to fossil fuels. And so even though more depressed people are allowed to survive today than they would have been in the past, creates an increased amount of depressed people, because they're allowed to be survived. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, I don't think they should have to be depressed, but I don't think it's an increase in the amount of depression. It's more of an increase in the amount of people, and because of the ability to keep people alive, more people who are handicapped in both mentally and physically are able to survive today than were in the past. So I don't think we have an epidemic of Down syndrome. I think it's that in the past, if they had Down syndrome, they just died. And so
you
now
know,
more
we
people with
don't
Down
have an
syndrome.
epidemic of Down syndrome. What we have an epidemic of is well, chiefly depression and anxiety.
Well, I'm trying to make a comparison between there. So back in the past, people with Down syndrome were pretty much immediately killed. They didn't survive. They weren't brought up as children. They were left outside and died within the first few years. Nobody took care of them. Now, the amount of people with Down syndrome who live past the age of 20, 30, 40 has significantly increased by several hundred, maybe 1,000% than used to in the past, because we take care of them now, because we have resources and we can provide for them and keep them alive. Back in medievals, no one did that. They did not survive. They were not taken care of. And so I wouldn't say that we have an epidemic of people with Down syndrome living past 40. I'd say that that's a symptom of the fact that we can provide for people. And the same thing applies to with people with severe depression. I was diagnosed with major depression early on in childhood, and I was able to survive because people took care of me. If I was living in medieval times, that probably wouldn't have happened. I may not have survived. And so I think that a large portion of the increase in the percentage of people with depression has to do with the fact that we can provide for those people, and they don't need to provide for themselves like they did 200-300 years ago, which is in large part due to fossil fuels. And so I think that the epidemic of depression is kind of like the epidemic of people with Down syndrome living past 40.
Yeah,
It's
no, that's really not the case. I mean, the figures are very clear that that there is a correlation between the growth of depression and anxiety, and by the way, autism, which probably has different causes, but we could also talk about. They're correlated with economic growth and with inequality. And in terms of you're talking about the Middle Ages, well, that's complicated with feudal system, etc., etc. But if we look at indigenous societies and some peasant societies, it would appear actually that in some cases they've got very good ways of looking after people who struggle to be economically active. And it's not necessarily true at all that those people, get thrown out to die or anything like that. I think that we've got a society which has been fueled by fossil fuels, which has various good features and various bad features, and we should try to appraise those clearly. I think it's a mistake to think something like, well, our society is basically brilliant, and that's due to fossil fuels. When you speak to people from Tibet, for example, as I've done, or various other parts of the world which haven't been so transformed by fossil fueled capitalist growth, etc., they find many features of our society astonishingly cruel, alienating, empty, etc. Look, what I can tell you for sure is that if we carry on our current path, for sure, mental ill health will continue to escalate as a result of continuing growth in inequality, rising insecurity, and terror for our futures. But that can all be turned around if we actually start to look reality in the face, start to think and feel as a body of people that want to co-create a better future. And start to get serious about creating that better future, then suddenly our mental health will start to turn around. That's the great lesson of teachers such as Viktor Frankl, who famously survived the concentration
Holocaust.
camps in Germany. Yeah, that what people really need in their lives is a sense of meaning. That a sense of meaning is actually even more important than food and water, incredibly, and that. What we so badly need is a reason to live, and we can find it. The disasters and the growing levels of fear, depression, grief, anger, etc., which our world's exposed to, that could all become something that was actually good. And this is the central argument of my book, Why Climate Breakdown Matters. That ultimately the reason why it matters is that it can, through the crucible of it, we can actually start to create a world that is better. That the terrible tests that we're being exposed to could actually improve us as human beings, and be the making of us, and be the making of a civilization which can come after this one, and have some of the best features of it, but get rid of all the crap.
Gotcha. We have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Winston's mom asks, I have read that if the Gulf waters of Florida hit a certain temperature, 8 out of 87 degrees, then Florida will flood. Does Dr. Reed have any thoughts on this?
So I'm no expert on Florida, and I've never been to Florida, but I have studied this a little bit. And this prognosis for Florida is pretty grim. The Everglades, which has been savagely treated by humanity, will start to expand again in some areas, because there are going to be places where humanity can't keep on keeping the sea out. Places like Miami are in terrible trouble. I mean, it's virtually impossible to defend these cities against rising sea levels because of the porousness of the rock. Florida is going to be transformed over the next century, and a lot of it isn't going to be pretty. The only sort of vaguely amusing part is that a lot of people with very expensive real estate, who have not made the best use, ethically speaking, of their life and of their wealth, are going to end up a lot poorer.
Gotcha. Pine Creek asks, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you hate capitalism?
So I helped create a book a few years ago, which is about some of what we've been talking about. It's called Facing Up to Climate Reality. And there's a very interesting chapter in that book by a colleague of mine called Richard Douglas. And what Richard argues, when I started reading the chapter he wrote for us for this book, I thought, this is completely unconvincing. There's no way I'm going to buy this. He argues that in the future, there's going to be a kind of synthesis of capitalism and socialism, that the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, is going to force societies which remain functional to move in some respects towards socialism, but to retain features of capitalism. And it'll all be centered around ecologism, if you will, and survival. So I'm not going to accept the premise of the question, in the sense that I think that in the future, if there is going to be a future, we're not going to continue to have capitalism as we know it. I think in some parts of the world, it will start to get transformed. And if that doesn't happen, then we'll just see massive collapses, and that will be the end of capitalism, the end of a lot more besides.
Is that kind of like, because what most economies, most big European economies are mixed economies right now? Like, is that what it means? What you mean by a combination of capitalism and socialism?
But Richard Douglas's argument goes further. He thinks that there's going to be a massive growth of cooperativism. He thinks that a number of things which at the present time are settled by markets, it's just going to become obvious that that untrammeled markets are not suitable for settling them anymore. What I certainly do think, coming back to the question, is that well, yeah, as I've already said it, really, there is no future with untrammeled capitalism, and people are going to look back in astonishment at some of the things we tried to solve with by way of markets.
Gotcha. Tinkle Tink asks, "What's his plan to turn us back to serfdom?" Question mark. Because I think that's a
Right.
legitimate concern that many people on the right have, is that if we do lose fossil fuels, that would essentially have that impact.
Look, in the future, there's going to be a lot more people working on the land. A lot of people want to work on the land at the moment. You know, the percentage of people who can work on the land in countries like the US and UK at the present is minute, because we've got these mega farms, mostly now owned by corporations or the super rich, which are super automated, and there's very little opportunity for land ownership, for community supported agriculture, etc. So, you know, the concept of being a peasant has got a very bad rap. But actually, having people who are able to sustain themselves and have a living relation to the land is a very good thing. And it's not about forcing people to do it. It's about providing opportunities for people who do it to carry on doing it, and providing opportunities for more people who want to do it to be able to do it. I don't have a plan. What I have is a set of knowledges and overviews of things that makes it extremely clear that if the plan is kind of carry on as we are or try to green it a bit, that is just not going to happen. If we get to 3.5 degrees of global overheat, that is a civilization terminating event. Maybe through food system crisis, maybe through other means. We're already closing in on 1.5 degrees. We are certainly going to pass the 1.5 degree safe threshold, tragically. And we need to start to develop a plan, because what you're going to get if you get civilizational collapses starting to occur, you will get some kind of forced forms of feudalism, warlordism, etc. That is where we are headed. The point is to find a different destination.
Gotcha. Pine Creek says, "Work the land?" Question mark. If a liberal just looks at a shovel, their hands bleed. I think to try to steelman that question, it's more like a lot of people. I think majority of people in capitalistic countries see working the land as a detriment to their life, not something they would want to do. I think that many people would not want to do that, and so if they were forced into a society where that was the case, I think they would see it as a detriment to their lives. And so I don't think most people in most Western countries would enjoy being farmers. Farmers is incredibly hard work. You wake up at 5
Yeah,
a.m. and you
sure,
stay awake.
sure. But it's not about most people. It's about because right now the percentage who do it, it's about 1%. I'm talking about making it open to being like 3%, 5%, 7%. It's also about people having balanced lives, right? We've been told to look down on people who work the land. We've been told that it's not as important as using your mind and so on. This is all kind of foolishness, really. I spend most of my time teaching in university and running the moderate flank, which you can find at www.moderateflank.org. And the rest of my time, I mostly spend working the land here. We just have a small amount of land. It's a third of an acre. But it is incredible how much food you can produce from a third of an acre or less if you put a bunch of effort and love into it. And right now, beyond my computer, I can see my garden, and I can see a greenhouse and a polytunnel and an arbor and an orchard that we've planted. And it is absolutely beautiful, and it really gives me a lot of a sense of meaning. And it's obviously one of the reasons I'm doing it is to make a little bit of contribution to community resilience. So, you know, there's a number of ways in which this kind of thing is good. So I'm not really a liberal. I don't accept that label. I'm a post-liberal. I'm a communitarian and an ecologist. When I look at a shovel, I think, great, this is a chance for me to move some manure or move some leaves. And that's exactly what I spent an hour doing just before this call.
Awesome. All right. Our next question is uh, Platon's arms. What are good ways to the necessary degrowth?
Yeah, good. Well, that's a huge question, terribly important question. Um, the first thing to do, the first way, is to accept a lot of what this kind of stuff that I've been trying to say today, to really accept and face the gravity of the situation and the necessity for change. And then we should think about the desirability for change, which goes back to the conversation Tom and I were having 5 or 10 minutes ago about a number of the ways in which our current society is not like a utopia. In fact, there's all sorts of ways in which it's incredibly harmful and inferior and so forth. And so we start to think about some of the ways in which a life without net economic growth could actually be a better life. We have to challenge the primacy of economic growthism and GDP in public debate. We've got to get to the point where broadcasters, for example, don't say, as they always do still at the moment, stuff like, so the GDP growth, the rate has edged up to 2% per year. That's great. And we're out of danger of a recession. We've got to get beyond that way of thinking and talking. We've got to get a politics which starts to be serious about recognizing. And again, Tom, this comes back to what you said earlier, the importance of quality of life, which is not at all the same amount, not at all the same thing as the amount of stuff that you own or the quantity of money that you have or anything like that. Quality of life is a completely different thing, which can be realized in completely different ways, including ways which are radically less demanding of the earth. So that's an indication of some of the ways. I could talk about this for so long, this wonderful, vital question. Perhaps one more thing to say right now is the term way itself is helpful here. Some of you may be familiar with Taoism. The word Tao basically means way. So the Tao is the way. And we need to get serious about finding philosophical, psycho-spiritual ways of being which are different from our current way. The crisis that we're in is not just a political crisis or a climate crisis. It's also a spiritual crisis, a cultural crisis, a crisis of meaning. We need to find ways. We need to find ways that are ways through that.
Gotcha. Jake Yu asks, why should China and other developing countries stop using fossil fuels? I think that's a really important question because fossil fuels is one of the most important ways that developing countries have to grow, and developing renewable resources is really, really expensive and difficult to do. And so if a developing country stops using fossil fuels, that would definitely impact their lives significantly more than it would in developed countries.
Yeah. So this is a complex, very important, as you say, question. The simple short answer, of course, is that if they and we don't, then we're all fucked. But obviously, one has to get a bit more sophisticated than that. So one answer to the question, which I think is really important, is they don't have any obligation to unless we actually lead the way. I mean, we in the US, and in fact, even more so in the UK, are the ones who started the trouble and have profited from it the most. We have to show genuine leadership. And what that means is things like free green technology transfer to countries that are poorer than China. I mean, China is doing quite well now in terms of developing green energy, of course. But to other countries which are much less resourced than China, we ought to give them the technology for free. And we ought to get serious, go back to the last question about degrowth. It's time to end the fetish for economic growth. It's time to recognize the nature of the crisis, to recognize the importance of quality of life and the availability of achieving quality of life through other methods than so-called development, i.e. growth, and then through the use of fossil fuels. We have to show leadership, and until we show some leadership, then there is absolutely no reason why they should listen to any lectures or preaching that we give. But what's implicit in what I've said is that this concept of development, so the term developing countries is in the question. This concept of development is itself prejudicial. the concept of development basically was invented by the Truman administration as a way of trying to say to the rest of the world, you have to be like us. And we're going to allegedly help you to do that. We need to think beyond the concept of development, not just beyond the concept of growth even. And there are people who've been doing that for some time. There are people in the global south and the global north who've been doing that. One of them is my colleague, Helena Norberg-Hodge, whose work I very strongly recommend with Local Futures. For example, her book, Ancient Futures, very, very powerful vision of a post-development world. So ultimately, what China and other so-called developing countries should do is what we should all do, and what we have to show leadership in, those of us who have experienced a great deal of development, is to get sane about a better future, which can be partly based on renewable energy and obviously, and needs to be partly based on seeing beyond the growth and development paradigms and seeing what life is really about, which is nothing to do with having more stuff.
Gotcha. Keyam Inc. asks, do you think climate change stunts actually help your cause or just make people annoyed and shut down, to your words, and defeat the point? I think he's referring to like the recent art scandals where people were throwing tomato sauce on the paintings.
Yes, yes. So I know the people who've done that. Important to point out, by the way, that they didn't actually damage the paintings.
Because they're covered by glass. They're not damaged.
I totally take the point of the point. And that is why we've created the moderate flank. So as I mentioned at the start, I helped launch Extinction Rebellion, and I'm proud of what we've achieved in the UK and in other countries. But after a couple of years, I thought, well, we've made our point. To carry on more may be self-defeating. It's time to seek to do something which is less confrontational, less polarizing, more positive, can involve more people. That is what the moderate flank is all about. I'd urge you to check it out. What we need is millions upon millions of people taking action for climate and nature. And I think that that millions and millions of people are never going to join the radical flank. So yes, I think it's time to think beyond climate change stunts, if you will, and towards the positive work that's actually needed in community climate action, in transforming workplaces, professions, businesses, and much more besides.
Gotcha. Edison asks, what does he say to people that still trying to claim that climate change is caused by the sun? I think he's referring to the argument that the temperature of the sun is increasing, it's heating up, and that would be the primary cause of climate change.
Yeah, I don't say anything to them. They're not worth the time of day.
Gotcha. Pine Creek asks, is climate change activism your reason to live? Because I think you mentioned something earlier about reasons to live.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it like that, because that makes it sound as though if I wasn't a climate change activist, I would top myself, as we say here colourfully in England. But in another sense, sort of, yes. I mean, yeah, it gives me a great deal of meaning, as in the kind of way I've outlined a little bit earlier. I think that we all need to ask ourselves, what are we here for? What are we in service to? A really great question is what is my legacy going to be? Or to think about writing your own obituary. You know, what kind of, if you were going to be in a position to write your own obituary at the end of your life, Pine Creek or Tom or anyone on this call, anyone listening to this, or anyone watching, if you were going to be in a position to write your own obituary, and hopefully, you know, this obituary would only actually have to be read, you know, many years into the future, what would you want it to say? And that really does concentrate the mind, it seems to me. I think that most of us, when we get beyond a certain kind of sense of kind of flippancy or irony or whatever around this kind of question, we focus on what's really important. And I think that there is nothing more important than giving a decent future to our children. There's nothing more important than doing the right thing. There's nothing more important than contributing to heading off the biggest catastrophe which has ever been looking to come our way. So in that sense, yeah, I think that climate action in general is a powerful reason to live. And I would urge everyone to do what I've just, at some point, to do what I've just suggested. Ask yourself, what do you want your legacy to have been? What do you want to have contributed to? How would you want to be able to write your own obituary? And it will make clear to you what it is in this life that is there for you to do.
Gotcha. Pine Creek's obituary would be annoyed the most liberals and theists as possible. That would be his tombstone.
That's the flippancy and irony bit. I think we can do better than that.
John Smith asked, is billionaire climate change philanthropy doing more harm than good?
Really interesting question. Tricky one to evaluate. And my expertise here on this question is limited. What I think I can say is a few things that may be of interest. Firstly, it's clear that some billionaire climate philanthropy has done real good. So, for example, one fact that not that many people are aware of is that there was an important funder at a relatively early stage in Extinction Rebellion. He was a billionaire and he gave £1 million to Extinction Rebellion. And that was a significant percentage of the money we had in the early days to really get off the ground and get organized and give people a small amount of money to allow them to spend a large amount of their time planning the incredible stuff we did in 2018 and 2019. That was an incredible investment. I mean, that £1 million, the amount of transformation that leveraged was absolutely astonishing. What I think we can also say is that a lot of billionaire climate philanthropy is wasteful, and a lot of it doesn't go to the places where there is most need. So, most of it doesn't go to movements. Most of it goes to things like tech and development. Some of it goes into doing stuff which is extremely questionable, such as some of the money that Bill Gates has been putting into geoengineering, attempts to engineer the entire climate of the Earth, which I think is another of those very unprecautious, reckless things that people are thinking about.
Going to Mars?
Well, that's what I was going to come to next, which is, as some of you might know, I'm a critic of the so-called long-termist movement. People like William McCaskill, Nick Bostrom, fellow philosophers of mine. Elon Musk calls himself a long-termist. I think that the long-termist paradigm is extremely dangerous. If you want to look into that, you could check out my pieces in Emerge or in The Conversation, for example. And I've got a big piece that's coming out soon in Current Affairs about this, which will be quite a takedown, I think. And then when you've got people like Musk and Bezos interested in interplanetary, etc., colonization, well, that's really got nothing to do with climate philanthropy. That's pure egotism and fantasy. There's no escape. That's why this is much more challenging than an emergency. There isn't going to be any getting away to other planets for anybody. It would be far easier to make oneself safe in Antarctica, or for that matter, at the bottom of the ocean. No one's taking living at the bottom of the ocean seriously. It'd be much easier to live at the bottom of the ocean than to live on Mars. It's all just dangerous distraction and fantasy and a criminal waste of money.
Gotcha. There's two similar questions here. John Smith asks, what do you think about the impact the military-industrial complex has on climate change? And Mr. Kreening asks, how do you feel about, could we fix the carbon print by eliminating the meat industry? So the meat industry and military-industrial complex.
Yes. So on the military-industrial complex, yeah, this is a serious matter. I mean, one problem about militaries is that they often have a sort of pull on government resources that other sectors don't have, because they basically say to government, look, you need to give us whatever we want, otherwise we can't guarantee your safety. And they're often extremely carbon profligate. So it's a real problem. Slightly on the other side of the coin, one thing which has been interesting for some time now is to notice the way that the military are quite good at assessing the threat from climate. People in the military are very hard-nosed. They're not interested in kind of vague speculations and sort of wishful thinking and so forth. So while Trump was president, for example, the military didn't in any significant way change their plans for adaptation to the worsening climate damage that is coming. They didn't listen to the nonsense that he was spouting, even when he tried to force them to. And there's a number of reports that the military have done now, especially in the US, actually, across the years, which have been made public or in one or two cases leaked, that show very clearly, back up very clearly some of the kinds of things that I've been saying earlier on in this podcast this afternoon. So that's actually probably the best thing that the military can do for us. Very hard-nosed, believable people, very clear on just how severe the threat is. In terms of the agriculture situation, that's a huge, complex question. If we eliminated the meat industry, that would have quite a lot of good effects and would result in quite a significant drop in our carbon footprint. However, my own view is rather more subtle than that. Firstly, I don't think we're going to be able to eliminate the meat industry. And secondly, it's not clear to me that that all of the so-called meat industry is as bad as each other. Or to put it more simply, there's quite good reason to believe that some ways of incorporating some animal agriculture into mixed farming, into food systems, and into rewilding as well. So, having some people who are engaged in hunting and so forth, that this is an efficient part of an overall way of treating the landscape. The real problem, I believe, is large-scale, intensive industrial agriculture, and that's mostly, but not exclusively, the meat industry. So what I'm trying to say is that it's too simplistic to say that going vegan is the way to solve our predicament, because if the way you go vegan is by eating highly processed foods and eating crops that are grown in high intensity, high input agricultural systems, then you're damaging the soil, and you're contributing to dangerous carbon emissions. You're not contributing as much as someone who eats meat, but you're still contributing significantly. I think the future lies in smaller scale farming in the kind of way I was implying earlier. I think the future lies in more people being back on the land. I think the future lies in a lot less meat being consumed, but very probably by no means zero.
Gotcha. We have been going for a little over an hour. It was a really great conversation. Appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, if you want to know about my campaigning, go to www.moderateflank.org. If you want to read my stuff, then Why Climate Breakdown Matters is a great place to start, but there are other books as well on particular topics. There's my book on parents and children in relation to the climate more than emergency, for example, and there's various others that people can easily find. And yeah, look, Tom, thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed the vivacious conversation with yourself and your listeners.
Thank you. Absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on again. Thanks again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Cheerio.